Thank you, and thank you to the Heartland Institute for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to address this audience, and I know that the afternoon grows long. It's a beautiful day outside. If you've not been able to go out and enjoy springtime, early summer in Washington, make sure you get an opportunity to do it today. You will not find a better day. So my task is to talk to you about, or set up, rather, a conversation about the economics of regulating carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. It's important, I think, in talking about economics is fundamentally, what are you buying? I'm buying something. Well, let's understand what it is that we're buying with this new legislation that's making its way through the House of Representatives. They establish a baseline that says we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States by 17% from a baseline of 2005 by 2020. Well, let's work the math. I did it just basically last night. It's 5.8 gigatons is our baseline carbon emissions in 2005. You look at readily available EIA projections of what the United States will emit in 2020, and you work the math, and it turns out that you've got to reduce our carbon emissions by 1 gigaton in 10 years. 10 years. Now, gigatons seems like a lot, but actually works out to probably not be very much environmentally speaking. And I challenge those in the audience that study this issue to come forward and chat with me about what exactly are we getting for 1 gigaton's worth of reduction in 10 years? Does that make a rat's bit of difference for the kinds of things that we've been talking about today? I suggest probably not. And if that's indeed the case, then we can reasonably view Waxman-Markey and similar proposals as really nothing more than an dismal down payment on what is inevitably various more extensive, more intrusive steps toward further reductions, greater reductions, and more intrusion into our lives and into our economy. Now, economics is called the dismal science, and unfortunately, the rest of what I have to tell you today is indeed dismal. First, the 3 points that I'll try to make. One focuses on the macro costs of cap and trade, of which I'll touch on just briefly. The second is to elaborate in some detail on an element of the Waxman-Markey bill that comes out of legislation developed in California and some other states called a low-carbon fuel standard, which many of you may not be aware of, but has the potential to be as insidious an economic burden on our country as the regular cap and trade. And then third is just to highlight where I think this debate may be going in terms of other intrusive regulations into our personal lives and into our economy. So on the first point, the costs of cap and trade, just broadly, last fall I commissioned 2 economists at Clemson University to put together for me a study of studies. Take a look at all of these macroeconomic studies that had been done, I charged them, and pull together for me a reasonable person's view of how much is this going to cost me, and put it in the context of the American family, because that's what will motivate our political class. The study's out on the table, you're free to take it, but what it revealed in looking at Boxman, Lieberman, Warner, which is fairly close to what we're talking about now, is GDP losses ranging from 0.3% to 3%, consumption losses of 0.8% to 1% per year, which translates to basically $1,100 for a family of 4 today, rising to $3,000 in 2050 using the most conservative of assumptions. The lowest ranges show that electricity prices will rise 15%, gasoline prices rising 13%, natural gas prices rising 20%, all on the low end. This is for 1 gigaton reduction in 10 years. The other costs of cap and trade, I suggest, are more insidious because they're more difficult to model. We don't know what they are, so they're out there. We will bear the costs. We will pay them. We just don't know how big they are. That includes the volatility of energy prices that this sort of regime puts into place. Energy demand is inelastic, so small changes in that demand relative to supply lead to sharp price movements. When coupled with the likely volatility in the prices of permits, the end result is the introduction of considerable uncertainty into the energy marketplaces. We observed this in Europe, where the price of carbon permits shifted 17.5% per month over the first 2 years. The much praised SO2 trading program here in the United States had a monthly volatility of 10% and an annual volatility averaging 43%, even with a safety valve. The SO2 allowance prices range from $66 a ton in 1997 to $860 a ton in 2006. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is that a reduction in the rate of GDP growth as little as 0.1% in a single year from a shock the size observed in the volatility of the SO2 market would cost us at least $13 billion. That's on top of the carbon price we're already paying. 2 additional cap and trade costs are what my boss Bill O'Keefe likes to call the licenses to cheat and steal. It's rent seeking, and we saw it. I'm a political scientist. Unlike how I'm advertised in the program, I am not a PhD political scientist, but I'm a political scientist nonetheless. We saw in the debate before the Energy and Commerce Committee log rolling at its finest. And it's log rolling is in a fight for the allocations. It puts an emphasis on lobbying efforts and the power of interest to secure a better deal for their constituents. Those costs are indeed socially wasteful, and those allocations distort the supposed efficiency of a cap-and-trade approach. Not surprisingly, these costs are not included in any of the models or projections of how beneficial this program will be, but an economist that I work with estimates that they could be as much as $60 billion a year. Mike Keynes, the Logistics Management Institute, those studies available on the Marshall website. The second cost are the costs of actually monitoring and enforcing this system. You have to have enforcement and verification of a cap and trade domestically or in a notional global agreement, but those costs are rarely considered. The structure of how you would do it is ill-defined. There are a wide range of options, cost, and potential for mischief that are available there. You have to monitor emissions, you have to audit the emissions, you have to oversee the trades, you have to oversee the offsets. That could be as much as as much as $1 billion a year in the United States, conservatively, globally, who knows? I think that's a dismal picture, but it gets worse, friends. The second major point, the low carbon fuel standards. Our good friends in California have pushed this idea forward. It's basically a cap and trade system for gasoline. Their proposal is that you cap the amount of carbon and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in gasoline to 90% of a particular level and reduce it over a particular period of time. So California says by 2020, our gasoline supply will only have 90% of the GHG emissions it had in 2005, or whatever the starting point is. The alternative fuels then are assigned weights of carbon intensity, and those weights, not surprisingly, are the subject of much political debate and log rolling. But if I can get my fuel to have a better weight than, say, ethanol, I'm better advantaged. And in this particular structure, you have no other choice but to provide this fuel in order to meet the mandate. So it's intended to provide protected markets for low-carbon alternatives, of which there are virtually none that are commercially available today. We took a look at this. I commissioned 2 economists, Mike Keynes and Ed Murphy, to look at this for me. The results of that study are out on the table, and what we found is that fuel price increases would rise from at a minimum 13 cents to over $13 a gallon. The annual cost to consumers and producers would be $80 billion to $760 billion. This is the literature. The annual tax revenue loss is $1 to $16 billion. You do get a lot of greenhouse gas emission reductions depending on which fuel you use, but it's incredibly expensive. The cost per ton of carbon removed ranges from $300 to over $2,300 per ton. If you look at this recent McKinsey study that came out that purports to evaluate all these different options for reducing carbon emissions over a period of time, the average cost there of their suite of approaches is $457 a ton. You would not do a low carbon fuel standard in California or anywhere if you were serious about this particular problem. This is a way to benefit alternative fuel suppliers at the expense of petroleum fuel suppliers. Now, you might ask, corn ethanol. We're investing a lot of money in that. We've made a big bet on corn ethanol in some parts of the country, and in national policy preferences. Ironically, corn ethanol is getting rolled itself in the weighting of the carbon intensity of its fuel in California. California is no fan of corn ethanol. In other states, it's better. It has better weights. The Waxman-Markey bill nationalizes this system. They haven't established the weights. Thankfully, that's for the regulatory process to play out. But pay attention to this. It is part of this legislation that will move forward. The other important facet of the low carbon fuel standard that I'll point out to you is that it's likely to be offset. So any reduction in carbon that you get as a result of this will be washed away by the reactions of the world market. Reduced petroleum imports into the United States will lower the price elsewhere, increasing demand for the high carbon fuel. Increased ethanol imports into the United States raises the price elsewhere for those, reducing demand for low carbon fuel. Keynes and Murphy estimated that at least 2/3 of the U.S. low carbon fuel standards carbon reductions would be offset by actions taken elsewhere in almost the immediate short term. My final point is that this is more than cap and trade. It's more than low carbon fuel standards. These can only be down payments based on the scaling. So where else might we go? Well, today's Green Wire shows one example of where we might go. We're spending $3.2 billion apparently in stimulus money on dollars for cities to reduce their carbon emissions, direct subsidy payments for energy efficiency to states and localities. The EPA's ANPR released last year regulated lawnmowers, maritime vessel designs, air conditioners, appliances, a whole host of other things. Aspen, Colorado, and elsewhere are putting in regulations that restrict idling at drive-thrus and banks and those types of things. Madison, Wisconsin is considering banning drive-thrus altogether. Seattle is putting restrictions on beach bonfires because they emit carbon. Estonia has a flatulence tax in place on livestock, and it's been considered elsewhere. Pennsylvania, more seriously, ordered its utilities last year to cut their electricity usage by 1% by 2011 and by 3% by 2013, and they empowered utilities to switch off hot water heaters and air conditioners during peak periods of demand if other actions weren't enough to reduce the demand at that particular time. That, friends, is the first step to energy rationing. That's where this path leads. It gets worse. The Food Climate Research Network at Surrey University in the UK predicts that we will have rationing of food and a re-engineering of diets and food choice because it's impossible to support the world's population, they say, at developed country diets. So we either need to come down or we need to control them. Overpopulation, of course, is the coup de grace of all this. There's a proposal coming out of Australia, I believe, that says that families with more than 2 children should pay a tax and have access to government-sponsored sterilization. Friends, we've walked this road before. It doesn't end well. That's the end of my dismal talk.